Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Tuesday, May 21st. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Akron game in 102 days, the game against Michigan in 193 days. All right, we get inspiration for these shows from a lot of places. Sometimes it is good old Twitter.com. Read a tweet earlier this week from Devin Radcliffe, one of the X's and O's gurus at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Just going to read it to you. Watched some old film, did some drawing, came to a conclusion. Bring back the Jack linebacker. We have talked about the Jack linebacker approximately 12,000 times on this show and on Buckeye Weekly over the years. Feel like we've seen it about 3 times since Jim Knowles has been at Ohio State, but is it time to bring back the Jack linebacker to Ohio State? Well, let's ask Devin all about that. Devin, of course, a defensive football coach by trade. So Devin, let us know, what did you watch and what was the Jack able to do in that defense that made you think, you know what, might be time to bring it to Ohio State?
Well, I was going back and, doing some off-season study and kind of inadvertently, unintentionally found myself looking at some of Jim Knowles' old stuff from his time, in particular at Oklahoma State. Previously, right before he came to Ohio State, of course, the 2021 season, I think it was his last year at Oklahoma State, if I recall correctly, and really taking a look at what he did with the infamous Jack linebacker position, which we have talked about. I think it's up to 15,000 times. Is the official count now. So we kind of lowballed the estimate there. And look at what he was able to use the Jack linebacker to do to fix issues in the run game. More often than not, we typically hear about the Jack linebacker as a hybrid pass rush, playmaker, defensive end. And yes, Coach Knowles does use that position to create pass rush, to free up a defensive end to go attack. In particular, typically in pass rush downs, go attack quarterback and try and make plays. And we have seen that used some here at Ohio State. What I want to talk about more, and what we still call them tweets, posts, comments, social media comment, was more regards to is how he uses them to match numbers in the run game, in particular against particular styles of offenses. So he tried it some in 2000, go back in history here. He tried it some when he first got to Ohio State. He tried Jack Sawyer package with as the Jack and had mixed reviews at best. Obviously, they didn't love it because they didn't run it at all last season at all. And we didn't see it at all this spring even. So it doesn't look like it's necessarily something they have in the plans for this coming season. But the reason I think they need to bring it back is, again, like I mentioned previously, what they do in the run game. So first, what you got to look at to start at a very basic level is what Ohio State does on defense. Is there a one-gap defense? The gap's defined as an area between the offensive linemen. And Ohio State typically, under Jim Knowles, or really as long as we can go back, even going back to Urban Meyer, typically has one defensive player responsible for one gap on the offense. Well, offenses are good. They're smart, so they find ways to create new gaps on the offense through pulling linemen. You pull a backside guard. Well, you create a new gap on a different side of the ball, different side of the center. Excuse me. So, what the Jack linebacker is able to do for Jim Knowles is he puts him a 3-man front. And in one particular call, he puts him behind the center as sort of a middle linebacker. If you're just looking at the alignment in between his two typical inside linebackers, I like to think of him more of a stand-up defensive tackle, because what that particular player is doing when he's in that position is he's reading the blocking scheme. So it looks like he reads the triangle, again, kind of like a traditional middle linebacker. And what I'm referring to is the guards and the centers, and he's reading the blocking scheme. So if we're going to talk about gap scheme, which is typically involves a puller, just to give an easy example. So the Jack will be aligned over the center. He'll see a guard pull from one side to the other. Well, the Jack will now become that +1 defender to match the numbers on that side of the ball for the defense. So the Jack will go to that side of the offense, and he'll fit that new gap created by the puller. You'll have your front side linebacker, let's just say our Mike linebacker in this particular example. he will fit the other gap on the play side. And what you've done is you've now made what every defensive coach is trying to create, what's typically referred to as a free hitter or unblocked defender, and that's the backside linebacker. So when you go back and watch the film of Jim Knowles' defense, that backside linebacker quite frequently is unblocked and free to make plays. So, or free to make tackles or make the big run through and make the stop. But it all occurs and happens because of what the jack linebacker is able to do by being that +1 to both sides of the ball to even up the numbers. So when you start watching teams like, we'll start Notre Dame, beginning this season, this previous season, when they started pulling linemen, running gap scheme, getting an I formation, adding an insert blocker, Ohio State found themselves in some trouble. They were not able to match the numbers immediately, and Notre Dame, in this example again, was finding some success with those insert blockers. Well, if Jim Knowles had the ability to jump in his jack package or jack look, he now had that +1 defender to match the insert, as well as the way the blocking scheme fits up and the way the run fits occur. The backside linebacker is now free to is unblocked and free to make plays for the defense.
Okay, so this all makes a tremendous amount of sense. And Jim Knowles obviously was doing this for a reason at Oklahoma State and presumably before that at Duke. So there's an obvious question. Jim Knowles has not suddenly gotten stupid. So why has he not incorporated this the first couple of years at Ohio State? There's sort of the idea that, it was sort of, you had to do this because you couldn't get the 5-star kind of guys at Oklahoma State, and you can at Ohio State, so you don't need to kind of tinker with stuff. Is it that? Is there some other reason he hasn't incorporated already? What do you think?
Here we're just getting into speculation. They tried it with Jack Sawyer. It just didn't fit right. Jack doesn't seem like he was necessarily the right fit. And, the way Sawyer finished the season last year, I am in no hurry to get him off the line of scrimmage either after the performance we saw in the bowl game. That was, probably the only bright spot we saw as Ohio State fans. So I'm just going to speculate and guess, but they may not particularly have the right fit for that type of player to fit there. It's not something that you've typically seen a Larry Johnson defense do. He's kind of a tried and true 4-down defensive line coach, and to get in that 3-down look, it does require a little bit of different teaching of your defensive line. You do have to play with a true 0 or head up on the center nose tackle. Now, granted, he doesn't typically 2-gap like say an old school Alabama nose tackle or Georgia nose tackle, Jordan Davis type. And as a sidebar, they're even going away from that some anymore. So I think it's probably not one necessarily big glaring reason why. It's probably just this whole bunch of things when you're sitting in the meeting rooms when it's off season and you're looking at strengths, weaknesses, what we do best, who we got. You come to the decision, this probably isn't the best for us right now at Ohio State. That'd just be my speculation or at best educated guess.
And they've talked about the jack a little bit, and they haven't talked about it as much this year, and that's probably based somewhat on the media kind of going, okay, fool me once, fool me twice, yada, yada, yada. I'm not going to ask about this. It really didn't get asked about a bunch this spring. When they did talk about it, they talked about Mitchell Melton, maybe CJ Hicks in that jack role. Is that the type of guy that you could see filling that role for Ohio State if they decide to do this?
One thing you hear Jim Knowles talk about, and he talks about this with his safeties and as well as the jack position, he's always had kind of a safety throughout his coaching career, safety that was kind of too big to be a DB, but not quite big enough to be a linebacker. So he found creative ways to get the best out of him, and he'd do all these different coverage rotations and get him in the box and put him in best position to make plays for the defense. And at the jack linebacker spot, it's kind of the same thing. He's not quite a linebacker, not quite a defensive end, but he's a guy that just runs and makes plays and has a real knack for the game. So I think for that position, you need a guy, Coach Knowles says himself, that's just kind of a ball player. Doesn't necessarily fit an archetype or prototype of a position that you have on a recruiting board, like, hey, all our defensive ends need to be 6'4" and 250, and all our safeties need to be 6'1", 205. The kid's just the player. The kid that plays that position is just a ball player. So, not necessarily a prototype that they have. So I think that's just something they got to look for, is who's our ball player that can just kind of make football plays for them.
All right, so we've talked about this for years. I mean, Jim Knowles showed up in 2002, and that was basically the only thing he got asked about that spring. And then he got asked about a bunch in the fall, and he got asked about it more last year, but less than in 2022. This year, really almost not at all. I had kind of given up on it, and then saw your tweet and thought, well, maybe it's, the gif of the girl trying kombucha or whatever, and she's no, never. What? Maybe, I don't know. That was me kind of considering the jack once again. So we've talked about this for years. Do you think there's actually a chance it really happens this year, or are they more likely to just kind of look around the defense and go, we got a bunch of veterans, we're just going to play it safe, we're going to stay in more of a base look? What's the likelihood they actually do something like this and really kind of go a little bit off the board here?
No, I would not anticipate any big major changes up front for the Ohio State defense. And again, the strength of defense probably is their defense. Well, secondaries should be pretty good as well, but the defensive line's got 3 or 4 returning starters. I'm not much of a draft pick follower guy, but I'm assuming in the early draft boards you could see both defensive ends and their 3 technique be day 1, day 2 picks. So I don't know why you necessarily want to overhaul what you're doing up front for just this season. But to give a longer answer, the jack position really needs to be a full-time position in order for it to maximize its value for the defense. This can't be a package or hey, we're going to run in this 5th-year senior because he's been such a hard worker and had bad luck in his career. We're going to throw him a bone, and run this little package. When it's most effective, it's when that guy's a full-time player, full-time starter, full-time position, and Coach Knowles is able to get in and out of his 3 and 4 down looks and move that guy around, so offenses are forced to account for him as a full-time, we're not sure where he's going to fit type player, again, to maximize the value of the position.
All right, well, if you enjoy hearing Devin talk about football as much as I do, or enjoy hearing Ross talk as much about football as I do, or any of our other X's and O's gurus, you can join BuckeyeHuddle.com right now. Take advantage of our annual membership sale. Just less than $70 a year gets you access to all of our great insider content covering the team, covering recruiting, covering X's and O's. That's all at BuckeyeHuddle.com on the Huddle board presented by Jeff Ruby Steakhouse. You can also find Devin on our postgame show. He and Mark Givler help host that postgame show after every Ohio State football game on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. They're always breaking it down for you as soon as that clock hits 0, breaking down what you saw, what they learned, all that, all at youtube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.